Welcome everyone to our Constitution Day panel discussion featuring Dr. Nicholas Cox and Dr. John Huntington. I really appreciate you all participating in this year's discussion. Obviously, this is always a timely discussion. But every year I feel like I can genuinely say there's so much going on. There's a lot of conversation that makes it even more timely. So we appreciate you participating in today's discussion. You'll notice, and I did this at the beginning just because I didn't know if we'd have a chance to raise the slide up at the very end. There's a QR code. If you're interested, this is obviously co-sponsored by Student Life, who handled, the majority of the heavy lifting for today's event, but also by the Center for Civic Engagement that you may be less familiar with. And so if you're interested in joining the Center for Civic Engagement's mailing list to hear about upcoming events that we have, for instance, on Monday at same time, we will be having another online event looking at the constitutional amendments that will be on this November's election here in the state of Texas. I definitely encourage you and invite you to join us. And also, let me introduce myself. My name is Rosalind Tenen. I'm the director of the Center for Civic Engagement here at Houston City College. I'm also faculty in the government department. So I've welcomed everyone. I wanted to also introduce our speakers before we get started and let you know a little bit more about them. And then I will turn it over to them to do their presentations. And then following that, we will open the floor for a little Q&A. So today's speakers are Dr. Nicholas Cox and Dr. John Huntington from the History Department here at HCC. Dr. Cox is our History Department Chair. He has a very impressive, history of teaching, and I should say, pun intended, history of teaching, a very extensive background in teaching in a number of places, from New York to Alief ISD, and of course here at HCC. He has also been the program coordinator for the history department, and he also served as interim dean. So he's wore a number of hats here at HCC as well as other places. Dr. Huntington is a faculty member in the history department. He has a book out that looks at the radical roots of modern conservatism. And he's also been featured in a number of publications that you'll notice there, from Politico to The Atlantic and The Washington Post. So we have some really impressive speakers here today. And I'm especially proud that our speakers are our own faculty from here at HCC. So we have a lot to be proud of. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Cox and Dr. Huntington. And as I mentioned, after that, we will then turn to Q&A and let you guys ask questions if you have any. All right. And I will stop sharing and I will let Dr. Cox take it away.
Oh, well, thank you. I just want to thank you very much for organizing this event, and you and Janet both. And thank you for thinking about inviting a couple of historians to talk at what is often an event aimed at students from our government faculty and our kind of people interested in current events, particularly. Initially, when John and I talked about doing this, we talked about bringing a little bit of 19th and 20th century expertise to this topic from our own training and our own research backgrounds. And maybe I'll do that a little bit, talk about the 19th century a little bit as it comes up today. But mostly what I wanted to do was talk to students, particularly about mechanisms in place for active, engaged citizens to help close what we often refer to as a democracy deficit. And let me kind of define what I mean by that for a moment. All across the country, I think a lot of people feel quite acutely that our government is not responsive to what the people want, that we have structures and representation and systems of government that don't reflect the will of the people, the majority desire for various policies. And when we talk about a democracy deficit, often I would want people to understand that is specific in the structures of our government. And I am a person who is optimistic by nature. I believe that our government structures are created by American citizens, and they can be altered and they can be changed or as Jefferson said in the Declaration, they can be altered or abolished. And so I think that if there are structures that inhibit democracy or that create a democracy deficit, then I do believe that those structures can be changed. And so I want to start by acknowledging that whenever people talk about changing the government, especially changing the structure of the government, you're going to receive responses from people who say it is the way it is, it's the way it's supposed to be. The founding fathers and the framers of the government were more prudent and wise and objective and nonpartisan than we are. And that's all debatable. That may or may not be true. But the fact of the matter is that the founding were a large and intellectually diverse group of people who disagreed about almost everything. And the documents that we live in, like the Constitution itself, are a result of a series of compromises that were hammered out in convention and in ratification conventions. They left an enormous amount of power to the Congress to pass legislation, to create laws. And they also included a structure in place for the amendment process to change the Constitution. And so when founders are held up as an authority for not changing things as a kind of bulwark against change, I like to remind people that they changed the Constitution almost immediately, right? The first 10 amendments, which I know you guys are going to talk about those amendments in November, are the Bill of Rights. And those came in and were initiated and passed by the very first Congress. The 11th and 12th Amendments, which don't get a lot more attention outside the Bill of Rights, were passed in the first decade of this country. The first to reform sovereign immunity laws for state courts, states in court, and the second to revise the Electoral College. Of all things that create a democracy deficit, the Electoral College might be one of the biggest, and we altered that in the 12th Amendment after the first election of Thomas Jefferson. So there is ample room in the Constitution for amendment and for change. I do want to acknowledge, though, that amending the Constitution is hard. It's hard. We've done it 27 times if you want to count the amendments. However, the 10 minutes come in as a Bill of Rights as essentially a unit. There are two big reform moments after the Civil War and during the Progressive Era when you get another block of amendments. And so when you set aside those 15 or 18 amendments in those three windows, we haven't really amended the Constitution that many times. The last time we amended it was in the early 1990s, more than 30 years ago. So it's very difficult to do. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about ways that we can change the structures of our government that don't require constitutional amendments. I'm going to be a little schematic here, but I'm going to start with the branches of government that are very familiar to all of us, right? You've got Article 1 that lays out the structure of the Congress. Let's take a look at Article 1 in the Congress first. You guys all know that it's bicameral, meaning we have an upper house, the Senate, and a lower house, the House of Representatives. If you could turn our attention to the Senate for a minute, I think everybody understands that when you give 2 senators per state, that every state is treated equally, and that right there creates an undemocratic structure in our representative system, because obviously California and Wyoming are not the same size in terms of people, but they have the same number of senators. So what can we do about that? How can we make the Senate more democratic? If we're not going to abolish the Senate, which would be a very radical proposal that some might favor, then the thing to do is to change the number of senators. And we can do that a few ways. The easiest way to change the number of senators is to add more states. With every new state, you get 2 more senators. It's not necessarily the case that more senators is going to make the Senate more democratic, because some states are very rural. But if new states were very urban, then that might tilt the representation in the Senate towards urban populations, which would be more democratic. And I think most people know that the candidates for potential statehood that are most likely to be quote, on deck would be Washington, D.C., the capital, and Puerto Rico, a territory. Now, these are both territories that could be states. They would need to go through the statehood process internally and through Congress to become states. But you could imagine the possibility of having 2 more states added and 4 more senators. Now, from a 19th century perspective, I do want to remind people that we have 50 states. And since I was born, we haven't added any more. There have been no new states. When my father was a child, Alaska and Hawaii were not states yet. So there were states added after my father was born. When his grandfather was born, Oklahoma Arizona, New Mexico, those weren't states yet either, right? So we've added 5 states in the 20th century. We had 13 to start with, and we added a couple of more like Kentucky and Tennessee and Vermont in the 1790s. But in the 1800s, there was a 100-year window where we added 29 states. Now we're a quarter away through this century, and we've added 0, right? And so I think actually it's quite overdue for adding statehood for DC and Puerto Rico. I think that would increase the representation democratically in the Senate. Now, if we continue to think about the Senate in terms of its structure, there are other ways to add senators, which does still require adding more states. And I want to talk a little bit about the 19th century again. One thing we have not done since the 1860s is divide states. But that is something the United States used to do as well. You know, Tennessee and Kentucky were hived off of Virginia and North Carolina. Vermont was kind of cobbled together with pieces of New Hampshire, New York, and Canada. In the 1820s, we split Maine off of Massachusetts. And then in the 1860s, West Virginia hived off of Virginia. And in fact, after Texas statehood, about a third of its territory was ceded back to the federal government for the creation of New Mexico and partially Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado as well. And every time we do that, every time we take a state as it exists and divide it into new states, you get new senators. And I think it's not impossible to imagine that some of our largest states might be overdue for reconsideration as well. I think this might be a radical proposal for some people, but the biggest states are California, Texas, New York, Florida. They have very substantial urban-rural divides, and they're all large enough, in my view, to contemplate division. The last thing I would say about the Senate in terms of closing the democracy deficit is that they have internal rules of the body that they set themselves, whether that is supermajorities or cloture votes or simple majorities to pass legislation. And often the rules of the Senate are adopted in an effort to slow down the passage of laws that come out of the House or that are more popular. I think a lot of people see the Senate as, in its essence, it exists to put the brakes on democracy. Let me turn my attention now to the other side of the Congress, though, and look at the House of Representatives itself. Clearly, if we add more states, it will also create more representatives. Every state gets at least one House member. One of the things that would happen if we divided states is that those new states would get new House members as well. So we could increase the size of the House by increasing the number of states, just as we would in the Senate. But the thing I think most people need to keep in mind, and this is intended to set things up for a conversation in a moment about the Electoral College, is that in the 19th century, when we added states and when we added population, when the country got both geographically and demographically larger, we added members to the House. And every decade, the House got a little bit larger. And by the end of the 19th century, they did start to reapportion the House so that the population and the representation in the House were proportionate. However, instead of capping the House, they left the smallest delegations in place, and they just got larger and larger and larger. Now, it was not until 1929 that we permanently capped the House, and that's had some serious consequences. For example, right now we have 438 members in the House. Well, when the Constitutional Convention was held in the 1780s, the proposal was to have a House district with 40,000 residents. George Washington, who rarely intervened in these discussions, stepped in and said that 40,000 was too large and he preferred it to be 30,000. And that's what it got set at initially, 30,000 people per House delegation. Now that we have 340 million Americans and 438 representatives, every House district is nearly 800,000 citizens, 800,000 residents, I should say. That is an enormous leap from 30,000 to 800,000. Right? These districts that we live in now, our congressional districts are more than 20 times larger than the framers imagined. So you could, for example, uncap the House. If we uncap the House, what would that do? Would we have a House of Representatives that's now 20 times larger with 9,000 representatives? I don't know that that's pragmatic. But you could uncap the House in a way that allows for the House to gradually grow as well. And if that happened, there would be more representation for the urban districts, because right now you have states with one representative because they're quite small and rural. One thing that uncapping the House would do would, it would drastically change the composition of the Electoral College. And I'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about the presidency. But uncapping the House would be an enormous impact. I think we should uncap the House to the point where the House is perhaps 2,000 members instead of 400. I think that 8,000 or 10,000, if we had 30,000 member districts, would be too large of a House. But that number between 438, which we have today, and maybe 8,000 or 9,000, which 30,000 member districts would create, there's a big gap between 430 and 8,000. We could find somewhere in the middle that's pragmatic. The last thing I would say about House representatives and the democracy deficit is the very clear use of gerrymandering that's gone around in the country. Whenever there is a congressional reapportionment, which is required after every census, then every state generally has to reallocate its representatives. I should say it's not every state. Some shrink, some grow. Not everybody has a change in representation every decade. But that gerrymandering comes into play when new state maps are drawn by their legislators. Only 11 or 12 states have nonpartisan commissions, and even in California, you see they have used a referendum to set it aside. So really, 40 states, a vast majority of states, are not using nonpartisan approaches to House delegation map design. And the reason that California suspended their nonpartisan commission is because of the invitation by Trump, by Texas, to remap its delegations in between the census. It's a sort of a voluntary remapping in Texas that's going on right now. So that effort to increase democracy has to confront the use of gerrymandering for both racial and partisan gerrymandering that's being done by the political parties in power. Something has to be done. I think that the nonpartisan commissions that became very popular after the 2000 and 2010 censuses were an effort to try and take this out of the hands of politicians and make it more nonpartisan. That has, for the states that chose to do that, kind of limited their ability to combat the hyperpartisanship of gerrymandering that we're seeing in places like Texas right now. And so you can see, for example, California retreating away from it. I don't think that we have an easy solution here, but we can certainly talk more about what to do. All right, so let me pivot. One last major topic actually is the presidency and then the Supreme Court. I want to talk about both of those before I turn things over to Dr. Huntington. When we elect a president, people do understand quite clearly, I know, that we do not do that directly. We do not have a direct electoral democracy to choose the president. Some might favor that. Some of you out there might believe that we should have a national popular vote. We do, however, have an electoral college instead, and that is a result of one of those big compromises that we talked about earlier. When the framers were talking about how to choose the executive, they had lots of models available to them, but they could not contemplate establishing what it meant to be a national citizen in the 1780s, when all 13 of the states predated the Constitution and had their own standards for citizenship. They also didn't want to elect an executive from within the legislature that was himself not independent of that legislature. So the Electoral College becomes a kind of compromise middle between having a direct popular vote or an indirect internal legislative vote. And as you all know, the Electoral College is the exact same size as Congress, has the same number of electors as the state delegations have to the Senate and the House. And what that means is that the 100 senators make up almost 20% of the total number of that 538 in the Electoral College. Now, the members of Congress and the electors are not the same people, they're just the same size. But as long as the Senate represents rural states, and as long as the Electoral College is equal to the House and Senate combined, then that House cap keeps the Electoral College small, while the Senate distortion towards rural states imputes that tilt into the Electoral College as well. And by impact, what that means is that we have now multiple times seen presidential victories in the Electoral College without a popular vote. Most recently, obviously, in 2000 and 2016, George W. Bush and Donald Trump won the Electoral College victory without winning a majority of the popular vote. Donald Trump in 2024 just won the Electoral College with a plurality in the popular vote. He has run for president 3 times. He has not gotten a popular majority at all. He went from 46 to 48 to 49%. Some of you out there may be aware that even in the 1990s, when Bill Clinton ran for president in 92 and 96, he won an electoral college majority, but he didn't have a popular majority either. He got a plurality because Ross Perot entered as a third-party spoiler. And I think for the last 30 years, I think it does go back beyond even the 2000 election. There have been people on the left and right, usually motivated by partisanship, who've been frustrated by having an electoral college that distorts the outcome of the results away from the popular vote. For the Clinton administration in the 90s, for example, there was a lot of frustration with the idea that Bill Clinton was not legitimate because he didn't have a majority of the popular vote. That if Ross Perot had not split conservatives between Bush and Perot or Dole and Perot, then there would have been a Republican in the White House. And I think a lot of that motivated some right-wing animus toward the Clintons. You will see that animus again launched against George W. Bush when he loses the popular vote in 2000 and wins the presidency anyway. And so I think that for almost my entire adulthood, for more than 30 years, I have observed a lack of accepted legitimacy by our presidencies by partisans on the other side. It's not to both sides this issue, because I think that there are very clear examples where the popular vote and the electoral college vote are misaligned. But in almost every election going back to 1992, we have not had a popular vote winner. Maybe with Obama, we had a couple of clear examples, and Biden as well. But here we are. And so how do we reform the electoral college? That's very difficult to do. Structurally, without a constitutional amendment, I think the methods really are changing the composition of the House. If you uncap the House, enlarge the House, you enlarge the electoral college, and that minimizes the Senate's impact. The other thing that you could talk about, and I certainly think that this was very popular and was bubbling up after the election of George W. Bush in 2000, was the idea of having a popular vote compact, where state legislatures who choose their electoral college delegates agreed that their electoral college delegates would be pledged to vote only in the electoral college for whoever won the popular vote. We are now at 17 states. They control almost 200 votes of the electoral college. However, it's not enough to clear that 270 majority. And like the 11 or 12 states for the nonpartisan commission on gerrymandering, it seems like in many ways it has kind of stagnated without reaching the critical mass necessary to overcome this challenge. So let me move on from the Electoral College, and we can talk more about that in Q&A. And I just wanted to talk about the Supreme Court. We'll just do a kind of full circle around these three branches of government. The Supreme Court, as you know, are appointed. In 2024, there was a big commission that proposed a series of Supreme Court reforms at the invitation of the Biden administration. One of the big reform suggestions was putting in term limits. We have lifetime appointments now. They could be appointed for 10, 15, or 18 years. The proposal was to put an 18-year term limit on the Supreme Court justices. Another proposal was not to replace resignations and deaths, but to add a justice every administration or every 2 years. You could imagine it doesn't matter who's in power. It would just be an appointment that you make every inauguration or every 2 years. That would give every president the same number of appointees, no matter how many times or no matter what party was in power. For those of you guys keeping track, Obama appointed 2, Trump appointed 3, Biden appointed 1. And so in the 12 years that Obama and Biden were president, there were 3 appointees. And in the 4 years that Trump was president, there were 3 appointees. And that's a misalignment in terms of the way in which we replace resignations and deaths instead of allow administrations to make an equal number of appointments. A lot of people raise questions about the size of the Supreme Court. There's nothing that requires it to be fixed at 9. We could enlarge the court. We could enlarge the court by virtue of having a routine appointment process or simply by increasing the number of Supreme Court justices. We used to have 1 per circuit. Now we have 13 circuits with 9 justices. So there's clearly precedent for adding at least 4 more. Arguably, we could add 5 or 10 more, whatever was necessary to do the workload. The last reform that often gets floated that I think would also matter quite a lot is to break up the idea of the Supreme Court as a kind of aristocracy or an elite, because they function in many ways as a partisan super legislature where the appointees from one president or the other are likely to support the ideological or policy positions of their appointed president, instead of having a Supreme Court that is composed of a fixed group of individuals, you could have federal judges rotate into those positions, rather by lottery or rotation or seniority. We have over 800 federal judges at various court, circuit, and district levels. There's no reason not to pull a council of 10 or 20 of those federal judges up to serve as a Supreme Court that's fairly randomized rather than static. So let me stop there. I think I may have talked a little more than 10 or 12 minutes than I planned to, but I wanted to talk about all three branches of government and ways in which I think we can close a democracy deficit, because I don't ever want people out there to feel like it's hopeless, like the structures make it impossible to improve things. If you don't like the way the government works, it can be changed.
Thank you, Dr. Cox. All right, Dr. Huntington.
Sure, let me get my timer going here. I'm a stickler. I want to make sure I got everything aligned. First of all, I want to begin by thanking Rosalind and Jana for organizing this and for inviting me to speak here at this Constitution Day event. And I also appreciate Dr. Cox's excellent examination of how Americans are trying to create or can create a more democratic society, especially within Congress, because for what I'm going to talk about the growth and limits of presidential power, mostly in the 20th century. But I want to go back in time to America's founding when the Constitution was being written and then kind of go forward from there. So let's talk about early ideas of executive power. The office of the presidency comes out of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So if you're thinking back to that time period, if you put yourself in the shoes of the guys at the Constitutional Convention, you're just a few years removed from the American Revolution itself. The founders, the framers of the Constitution are trying to fix the previous government, the Articles of Confederation, which did not have an executive office, and it had a lot of problems as well. But the founders were worried about recreating tyranny, right? They didn't want to just create another king, right? They had just fought a war to get rid of King George III. So they didn't want to do that, but they also didn't want to create they feared unbridled democracy. They didn't want to just turn government over to the unwashed masses, so to speak. And so as they're creating this new government, they're writing this constitution, they vest power in an executive branch to be led by the president. And so the president is in charge of executing or enforcing the laws, but his power is held in check by the other branches of government. Congress, to focus on them for a second, many of the founders, the people who were writing the Constitution, had served in Congress, whether at the state level or in the Continental Congress. And many of them viewed Congress as the most important branch in government because it was the place where you as a citizen kind of felt government most directly. It was the cauldron of representative democracy. It's where laws were created. And eventually also the Supreme Court will emerge as an important check against presidential power as well. And so the Constitution attempted to lay out this system where there was a balance between all of the branches of government. They each had checks on each other's power. And in the 19th century, the branches fought over their constitutional turf quite often. It was very common for them to fight over issues. And, the executive branch, the presidency, was at the center of these fights pretty frequently. For example, in the Indian removal of the 1830s, this era involved acts of Congress, it involved Supreme Court decisions, and a very willful president named Andrew Jackson. When we get to the Civil War, we see President Abraham Lincoln's power expand as he suspends habeas corpus. And so I wanted to kind of lay this foundation and talk a little bit about how the presidency functions and what the early ideas of the presidency and the early fears were, to say that people have been arguing about presidential power for a long time. Like, this is nothing new. But the 20th century kind of presented new challenges to the very delicate system of checks and balances. And so let's talk about the Great Depression. In 1929, the economy collapses along with the stock market, and Americans faced mass unemployment, up to 25% across the nation. And people were angry and frustrated and clamored for the government to do something, to get out there and help them. And so in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency on a platform of government action. To quote his inaugural address, he said, "This nation asks for action and action now." And he then went on to say, "I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people dedicated to a disciplined attack upon our common problems." And so he was kind of putting himself in charge. And he also went on to say in that inaugural address that if Congress won't do the job, I will. And so it was all hands on deck to fight the Depression. FDR passed more executive orders than any president. He still holds that record, by the way. And I want to clarify here, a lot of people think executive orders are laws. They are not. Executive orders are not legislation passed by Congress. Instead, what they are is orders from the president that can help shape the executive branch. So for example, an executive order might indicate a president's goals, or they might indicate how a president might enforce particular laws. And in many cases, a president will use an executive order to kind of put some pressure on Congress to do something. And in this case, that's what FDR often did. His early executive orders were kind of pressuring Congress to pass legislation to help people during the Great Depression, and Congress responded by doing exactly that, by passing those bills. And so all these new bills and programs that get passed end up becoming known as the New Deal. It's this national program intended to fight the Great Depression. And FDR's New Deal was essentially a massive increase in federal power. Now there's all these new agencies with new powers. To give you some examples, the federal government now assumed the power to regulate banks and the stock market through something called the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. The government established the power to ensure that your deposits wouldn't disappear from a bank if it went under through the FDIC. The government now had the power to create jobs for desperate Americans through programs like the Works Progress Administration. It also had the power to ensure the rights of labor unions through the National Labor Relations Board. And maybe most notably, it had the power to provide financial security for the people who were the most vulnerable through Social Security. And the New Deal really did represent an absolute sea change in American politics, because prior to this era, most Americans had never really dealt directly with the federal government. The federal government was like something that was far away in Washington, and most people just didn't really experience it. But now with the New Deal, the federal government was an institution that American citizens directly experienced, through relief payments, through jobs, through taxes, through the federal government was even providing hot lunches for school children. And so historian William Leuchtenberg, who's kind of like the dean of New Deal scholars, he said in one of his books, more than state and local governments, the federal government came to be the government, an agency directly concerned with the welfare of citizens. And so when people started to conceive of the government, they were often talking about the federal government and usually the president. And so the New Deal agenda was passed by Congress, but it was really FDR leading the charge. And to lean on Leuchtenberg again, he wrote, under Roosevelt, the White House became the focus of all government. It was the fountainhead of ideas, the initiator of action, the representative of the national interest. And so it was really the president, FDR, who was setting the tone. There were people who didn't like this. There were detractors, people who, some people worried about the larger federal government. There was a political philosopher named Albert J. Nock who said that the federal government was a blundering and wasteful and vicious leviathan. Some people worried about the power that FDR or the president was accumulating. One of FDR's political opponents, a Republican senator named Arthur Vanderburg, equated FDR's presidency to living under a political dictatorship. And at times, the rhetoric used to criticize Roosevelt kind of reached levels of hysteria where people were kind of accusing Roosevelt of being a communist. But one thing that's interesting is that the New Deal did hit substantial roadblocks. There were a number of times where New Deal programs that had been created by Congress and signed by Roosevelt were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In response to this, Franklin Roosevelt tried to add seats to the Supreme Court. And his whole idea was, essentially that if I add more seats to the Supreme Court, I will fill those seats, and then the Supreme Court won't declare New Deal programs unconstitutional anymore. They will survive the legal scrutiny. However, Congress refused. The idea of enlarging the Supreme Court proved somewhat unpopular nationally with the people, and Congress, as a result, refused to do it. And so in this moment, we kind of see a defeat of presidential power because the courts and Congress had, in some ways, checked the president, right? Now, as the Great Depression subsided and World War II kicks off, many of the New Deal programs kind of like ebbed away because there was no need to create jobs during World War II because there were so many jobs now available for the, to kind of fund, and people needed to work and create the American war machine. But other New Deal programs stayed and are still with us. Social Security is still with us. The FDIC still around, continuing to ensure deposits. The SEC continues to regulate the stock market. Whether they do a good job of that, maybe up to you. But the extent here, these programs enlarged the size of the federal government and very much empowered the president as the kind of leader of the executive branch. And many Americans were happy with these changes. FDR was popular throughout his presidency, incredibly popular. Social Security remains incredibly popular. It has roughly an 80% approval rating. People want the government to ensure the stability of banks. And so for many people, the power of the presidency, the expanded power of the presidency, seemed fine while it was seen as helping Americans, to get on with their daily lives. But as we move forward in the 20th century, there are more crises that will emerge that will put the power of the presidency under greater scrutiny. And more people will start to ask the question, like, how much power should the president really have? I think a good example of this is the Watergate scandal under President Richard Nixon. So to a brief overview of Watergate, Richard Nixon was up for re-election in 1972, and he was worried about losing, even though he probably didn't need to be. And so Nixon and his administration authorized a break-in, a burglary of the Democratic National Convention headquarters, which was in Washington, D.C. And so they hired some burglars to break in and steal documents and bug the phone lines. But the burglars were caught. They got caught and arrested, and immediately Nixon and his administration denied it and tried to start covering it up. The scandal drags on for 2 years as Nixon and his guys are trying to cover it all up. But eventually evidence comes out that Nixon and his men, the president and his men, knew about the break-in and actively tried to cover it up. While this is all going on, a historian named Arthur Schlesinger coined the phrase the imperial presidency. And the idea behind the imperial presidency is that the president is out of control, that the presidency has exceeded the limits placed upon the office by the Constitution. Essentially that, the president was acting like a Caesar, like an emperor. Now, Nixon ultimately resigns. He is kind of forced to resign. There's a number of congressmen who kind of appear at the White House and are basically like, you got to go. Like, people are not going to support you anymore, which might lead you to think that justice was served, right? That Congress has stepped in and was threatening to impeach him and remove him from office, so Nixon resigned. But in 1977, just a few years after leaving office, Nixon was doing an interview with journalist David Frost. And David Frost was asking him about the illegal actions that Nixon and his administration took to cover up Watergate. And Nixon said, well, when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. That's a literal quote from President Nixon. And Nixon is essentially arguing that the president and his thinking and his actions were above reproach. Now, Watergate created an appetite for change, very similar to the Great Depression. But whereas the Great Depression expanded federal power, at this point, and after Watergate, there was a desire to shrink federal power, to shrink presidential power, to put more checks against the power of the presidency. After Watergate, Congress will pass a number of laws seeking to limit the president. For example, the War Powers Act passed in 1973 will limit the president's power to initiate military actions abroad. This is also a response to Johnson's escalation of Vietnam. Congress also created the Office of Government Ethics to keep tabs on the executive branch and make sure the president wasn't, exceeding his power. And so here we kind of see with the New Deal and with Watergate, we see kind of the ebb and flow of American history. Presidents consolidating power, using their power, maybe exceeding their power, and then Congress or the courts, or both, clawing it back. In an ideal world, the world that the founders envisioned, the branches would always seek to balance each other, right? This is the Constitution the founders wrote. This is the way they envisioned that it would work, is that it's a world where each branch of government guards its own turf and kind of checks the incursions of other branches, kind of seeking to keep everybody in line. But the issue is that that's not really what's happening anymore. Instead, presidential power is on the rise again, and has been for quite some time. The consolidation of presidential power began anew under Ronald Reagan and has really steadily increased ever since then. There are new novel interpretations of the Constitution, like the unitary executive theory, which would essentially give the president an iron grip over the executive branch, allowing him to fire employees at will and giving him even more control over the federal government. And in 2024, the Supreme Court declared that presidents were immune from prosecution for what they called official acts. And so what the Supreme Court has essentially done is confirm Nixon's idea that when the president does something, if it's an official act, it can't be illegal. This effectively puts the president above legal reproach. And to further complicate matters, we live in an increasingly polarized world, and political polarization endangers checks and balances because congressional gridlock inhibits meaningful change. There's two parties, and two-party polarization means that when one side wins power, they're always trying to undo what the other side just did. And constitutional amendments, which were very frequent in the early days of the American Republic, they require a supermajority, and that's virtually impossible given the current polarization in Congress. So what was once viewed as the most important branch by the founders, Congress, now has the lowest approval rating of all three branches. People have just lost faith in Congress. When Congress fails to provide meaningful change, power migrates elsewhere. Republicans are fine with a strong president while they control government, and even Democrats are fine with presidential power as an avenue to kind of get around a slow-moving and sclerotic Congress. But the problem is that this can create a vicious cycle, one that emboldens more and more and more executive power. And Americans really should be wary of creeping executive power. And I'll give the final word here to the father of the Constitution, James Madison himself. As he wrote in the Federalist Papers, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. And so that's all I got for you.
Thank you. All right, so we're gonna move to Q&A, and I will open the floor. Jonna and Ashley, particularly Ashley, I know you have a group of students there. If you could, be able to kind of bring whoever over to the computer to ask their question if they have a question in the room. For those participants who are online, of course, you can put your question in the chat.
We did have a statement and a question early on when Dr. Cox was talking about the Senate and the House. And in the chat, it's talking about, wasn't the bicameral legislator the solution by the founders to the problem of the different sizes and populations of the states?
Oh yeah, I think that's from Audrey. Audrey, thank you for the question. I would actually say it's a little bit more nuanced than that because, in my view, and I think this is grounded in the documents, the bicameral legislature was more or less inevitable. Parliament was bicameral. The Virginia House of Burgesses was bicameral. Almost all 13 of the colonies had bicameral assemblies, except for Pennsylvania because of its kind of distinctive Amish traits. So I think that our Congress was always likely to be bicameral. But you are completely correct that how you decided who sits in the Senate and who sits in the House was done by state and population in order to balance those two prerogatives, right? The Articles of Confederation Congress, that Congress was unicameral. It had one House, one vote per state. States could send a varying number of delegates, but effectively with only 13 votes, the unicameral and supermajority requirements of the Articles of Confederation Congress were viewed as unoperable. So I do think, yeah, bicameral was inevitable, but the division of who gets where, how does a senator get to be a senator? How does a delegate get to be a representative? Yes, that is the big compromise.
Can I jump in and say something too?
Sure.
Yeah, I think also another thing we have to remember is that the founding fathers many of them were wealthy landed gentry type folks, and they genuinely feared democracy. They did not want to give regular people access to the levers of power. And the Senate was, I think, often seen as a way to kind of pump the brakes on the more raucous House of Representatives. And so that's another reason why the Senate was kept small, as a way to kind of to winnow away perhaps the influence of true democracy.
No, I agree with that, and it's related to the reason they have longer terms of Senate and also older age requirements as well. This notion of seniority, maturity, deliberation, throwing hot things in cool water, that sort of approach for sure.
Thank you. Do we have other questions in the chat?
We have a question here at Northline.
Okay.
Oh, where do I go?
Right.
Right here?
Can
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I got a question for you. What do you think our founding fathers would say about us having a convicted felon as our president?
Gosh, so when people ask what would the founding fathers think, I always want to remind people the founding fathers, who are these guys? Is it 10, 20, 50, 500, 1,000 people? When you look at the governors, the senators, the congressmen, the people in the Constitutional Convention, the people in the ratification conventions, it's hundreds of people. I would say that they were extremely preoccupied with reputation and with the performance of respectability and decency, if not in their private behavior, always meeting those standards. So I would like to say that universally they would all be publicly opposed to such a person in the White House. And also none of them were pure saints or angels themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the most famous signature on the Declaration of Independence is John Hancock, who was a known smuggler and widely considered a criminal by the Crown. And so it's also, the vast majority of people who signed the Declaration of Independence were enslavers. And so it's also tough to one thing that's difficult, as I think Dr. Cox just alluding to, it's difficult, I think, to go back in time and ask the founders what they think, because so much history has elapsed since then. And, our perspective, it's difficult to take our perspective and kind of push it backwards and say, and kind of read history through the lens of our own modern eyes. Like we do that to some extent. And I think that's necessary when we're kind of making new interpretations. But it also makes it difficult to kind of really understand, like, what would James Madison have thought, or Thomas Jefferson have thought about, Donald Trump or whoever.
We have another question here at Northline.
Yes, hello. So I remember there was a comment about sort of the people losing faith in the government. I was wondering if there is any advice or research or something that we can reference to kind of help build that confidence back and try to give power back towards the people.
No, I really appreciate that question, because I do want my comments and my teaching or whatever in this meeting or in other opportunities that we have to talk to inspire optimism, confidence, and hope, because I believe that we can make things better. I do believe that. And I think that where you find hope is in other people. And I think that sometimes you might believe in a cause, you may find allies in that cause, whatever that cause may be, right? Whatever policy, whatever values, whatever thing you care about, if you spend your time with people who share those values working towards that goal, even if you don't achieve that goal, I think that can be a meaningful and a good life. And if you do make progress toward that goal, that's the improvement that you're looking for. I would just emphasize camaraderie and persistence with people who share your values.
I think one thing also that is important to understand is that the vast majority of politics that affects people is local level politics. And oftentimes, because of the way our national media work and social media, is that we pay attention to federal politics more than state, more than local. And you can make the greatest change at the local level, by joining one of the local political parties, by getting involved in organizing, whatever. And so even though we do have a very powerful federal government that can, have incursions on people's lives and does affect people, oftentimes I feel like people forget how much impact even a small group of people can have locally.
I see a question in the comments that I'd like to tackle for a moment, if you don't mind. Is that all right?
Please do.
Oh yeah, this is from Coltrane asking about third parties. Coltrane, this is where I don't really have a lot of optimism, but also I don't know that a third party is the solution here. Let me start with the first part of that. We have these structures in place, and particularly it's a winner-take-all majority election system, which means that people who are first past the post win the election, and they carry out the government and they bestow the gifts, the spoils, the rewards. In an electoral college where someone has a majority and someone has a minority, if you have three parties, nobody gets a majority, right? And so nobody gets elected. And eventually it kind of breaks down to a point where there will always be a majority minority in the electoral college when you have a filter. And so our structure inhibits the possibility of third parties from taking victory in elections. But what that means is that you will always have an administration party that supports the people in power and an opposition party of people who don't. And that's effectively what the two parties are, the inside and the outside. And they toggle back and forth when they persuade enough voters to switch parties. You can label the parties whatever you want. They used to call them, for and against the king, the Tories and the Whigs, or the crown, the court and the country, right? Federalists versus Republicans, Democrats, Republicans, whatever. But it's a two-party system, and I think that what third parties can do though is they can mobilize passionate voters to inject an issue into one of the major two parties and on their flank and force them to attend to that. For the Republican Party, often this kind of libertarian insurgency was anti-tax, anti-spend. For Democrats, often the liberal insurgency was on environmental policies, the Green Party, things like that. You may occasionally see youth movements, particularly anti-war movements or anti-racism movements that can kind of put pressure on the more liberal parties. But basically, third parties work as advocacy groups, and they become co-opted. They become absorbed into the major two parties eventually. So I don't think that you're going to see a third party capture the White House or Congress. I think it's been over 100 years since ex-President Teddy Roosevelt used a third party to win some failing electoral college votes. And so, yeah, third parties are really a dead end. But that doesn't make them pointless. That doesn't make them purposeless. They're just not going to win elections.
Yeah, and we also haven't had a large scale party reorientation since the 1850s. That was when the Republican Party was created, and the Democratic Party was created in the 1820s. And so if you look at kind of the grand scale of American history from the writing of the Constitution and really like during George Washington's presidency of the formation of the Federalists and then the kind of the Jeffersonian like Democratic Republicans, there was a lot of creation of parties in the first like 60, 70 years of American history. And then it's been just the Democrats and Republicans since then. They have become very ossified. And so third parties, I think it was Richard Hofstadter, the historian, who wrote that a third party is like a bee. It stings you once and then it dies, right? A third party might have a very short lifespan, and it might, as Dr. Cox was saying, it might have a very particular avenue that is trying, like anti-war or more conservative tax policy or whatever, but it might be able to influence the big parties. But yeah, I agree with Dr. Cox. The real problem is the structure of the system, because we have a majority winner take all system, it lends itself to two major parties because you don't want to lose out to a third party. We saw this in 1992 with Ross Perot and George H.W. Bush. And this is, I think, at one of those situations where you could look at a parliamentary system and see like how there are multiple different parties that have to come together to form a prime minister coalition. That's just not really possible under our system.
We have one more question here in Northline.
Perfect.
Hi, I was wondering where you believe like our government is going with the rise in presidential power and polarization, kind of like a short term and then maybe long term. Like, are we heading more towards a solution or more towards a bigger problem?
John, this is more in your wheelhouse on presidential power.
It's so difficult. Historians always, I think, struggle to answer questions about where we're going because historians really don't start writing books or studying history until it's at least like 20, 30 years in the past. And so
100.
it's, yeah, if that, right? And so it's difficult to what I can say, I think, is that I do feel like we are living through some sort of reorientation in American politics. Now, exactly what that means, I don't entirely know. But I think we can see with the discontent in the Democratic Party right now, the Democratic Party is at its lowest point in popularity, I think, ever since they've been asking the question, is that going to force change upon the Democratic Party? I don't know. I assume, because unless they want to keep losing, you probably should change. In terms of presidential power, I don't know if it's going to increase or if there will, but in order to basically stop presidential power from increasing, Congress has to step in and act as a firm check against presidential power. But one of the things that happens is that in order to do anything in our country right now, you basically have to win all three branches: control the Supreme Court, control Congress, and control the presidency. And that's incredibly difficult. And so what has happened in recent years is, I think, one reason why people feel so frustrated with government is that it feels like nothing substantial changes. And I think people and as a result feel alienated from the government. And I think that's one reason why people lean so heavily on presidential power, because it's easy to look at one person and be like, that person's going to fix my problems, as opposed to relying on the messy business of, democracy in the Congress.
So I'll add to that a little bit from a 19th century perspective here. I think some of you all know that Trump is not our first president to be non-consecutively serving 2 terms with Biden in the middle, but we saw that in the late 19th century with the Cleveland Harrison, Cleveland Arthur, and all these elections back in the 1880s and 1890s. And what that would tell you is not just a non-consecutive presidency, but the flip-flopping back and forth between 2 parties. It wasn't just happening in the presidential election years, it was happening in the midterm election years too. And we see that now, right? Where Obama's elected in 2008 and he loses the House in 2010. He's reelected in 2012, and then the Democrats lose the White House in 2016. Trump faces a midterm backlash, blue wave in 2018, and then he gets reelected in 2024. That kind of constant flipping back and forth by the electorate every 2 or 4 years, it's actually not a lot of people. It's a very small amount of people in the middle moving on the margins, right? And that's an indication of an intense polarization where the vast majority of this country is split down the middle, and there's a small group of people in the middle that wobble. And we saw that. We saw that in the 1880s, 1890s. And we saw it at a time of intense economic distress. And also, this is the era known as the Gilded Age, where there was a lot of widening income inequality. And I think a lot of people are cognizant that those things are starting to sort of appear in our experience as well. And all I can really say is that it's sort of, darkest before the dawn, where there was a whole wave of major reforms in the economy and in the government as a consequence of these negative indicators. And so I tend to be an optimist. I do think people can drive. I do think people can change things for the better. I don't want them to get worse before they get better, because I just want things to always get better. But I'm not pessimistic that if you don't like the way things are, that they're only going to get worse. I don't believe that.
Any more questions? All right, well, I think we're at time. I want to first thank Dr. Cox and Dr. Huntington again for your time and for sharing your expertise. This was a really great discussion today. Thank you. Thank you to all of the participants as well for joining us. Again, please add your name to the Center for Civic Engagement's mailing list to kind of get updated on upcoming events. Monday, September 22nd, there is a presentation on constitutional amendments, but on the state side, many people don't realize that we actually vote on our constitutional amendments here in the state of Texas. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, and continuing this conversation about constitutions, but kind of looking at what our state constitution is all about, please join us. Thank you again. Thank you, Jana and Dr. Rhodes and everyone again for joining us today. And have a great day.
Yeah, thank you,
everybody.
guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank y'all so
Bye.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.